Hitler was left-wing in that he believed in socialism. Remember, Nazism is National Socialism.
Yep, it's gonna be that kind of video. That was Dennis Prager, the man who claims universities are indoctrinating your children, so he made a university of his own to indoctrinate your children, when he's not writing about how women should reconsider before denying their husband sex, or when his company is whitewashing slavery. He's saying stupid shit like this.
Very few people know that, especially if you go to college where you don't learn much.
Unfortunately, this sentiment, the one that claims Nazis were leftists or socialists, is common among some groups on the right.
Because it was a national socialist movement for a reason. And the socialist part of it wasn't accidental.
This isn't the first time Peterson spoke on this topic. Back in 2017, when he was considerably less insane, he held a Q&A where he was asked if the Nazis were left or right-wing, and he gave a nuanced and reasonable answer.
They differed from the international socialists, which were the Marxists, because they were much more concerned with national identity and racial identity. And to the degree that you regard nationalism and racial identity as primarily right-wing views, then the Nazis would have been right-wing.
He also went on to say something interesting, that he wishes to conduct some sort of experiment where he would present ostensibly left-leaning people with Nazi policies to see if they agreed or disagreed.
I do think it's reasonable to note that their extreme nationalism and ethnocentrism and racial identity probably has more in common with the radical right than it does with the radical left. One of the things I thought would be an interesting research project would be to take like 100 Nazi policies and to turn them into a questionnaire and ask people either how much they agree with them after I figured out whether they were left or right wing to begin with, or whether they thought the policies were representative of the left or the right. Because that could be studied empirically, and I don't think anyone's done it.
Now, this is something that I think could be interesting if done honestly and with a genuine desire for truth, but Peterson completely abandoned that years ago. Nonetheless, to this day, he still brings up his desire for this experiment.
You know, one of the things I would have done if I would have been able to hang on to my professorship at the University of Toronto would have been to extract out a random sample of Nazi policies and present them to a set of people with conservative or leftist beliefs and see who agreed with them more. And that analysis has never been done as far as I know, so we actually don't know.
Now, I do not trust 2024 Peterson to properly do the analysis. A study like that would require intellectual honesty due to the fact that omission could play a huge role in skewing the results. For example, if during Peterson's potential study, he asks left-leaning people if they would agree with free healthcare, they would probably say yes. And he could, if acting in really bad faith, consider that to be aligned with the Nazi regime's free healthcare program. But if he was to frame the question honestly and not leave out the fact that Nazi healthcare was only available to those deemed racially pure, then the left-wing student would almost certainly disagree. And so would the average conservative, by the way. That was a bit of a tangent, but I say all of that to say, please, for the love of God, don't let Peterson conduct this analysis. I think a lot of politically engaged people will look at the atrocities of past authoritarian regimes, reflexively distance themselves, and just blame their political opposition for them so they don't have to contend with whatever similarities might be present between their current ideas and those of past nightmare states. Although I can say with certainty and substantiate that the Nazis were neither socialist or left-wing, they also had little in common with conservatives or the mainstream right. I think chalking up your average conservative as a Nazi is just as lazy as when they call your average liberal a communist or when people say the Nazis were socialist. It's extremely important to understand the time and place where Nazism originates. To try and extrapolate and place Nazism in our current left-right dichotomy is immature, especially when we realize that a lot of people's understanding of left versus right today comes from American political culture. They consider Democrats to be liberals and therefore the left, which is already inaccurate, and they consider Republicans to be conservatives and therefore not liberals, which is also inaccurate. In reality, America is a liberal democracy. Economically, the Democrats and Republicans can both be considered liberal. Of course, the Democrats believe in more checks and balances when it comes to regulating capitalism, but nonetheless, they're all capitalists. No socialists, no communists in sight. I do believe there to be some fascist tendencies emerging in certain factions of the American right, but we will get to that in a bit. Since the American political dichotomy is seemingly in the forefront of many people's minds when trying to conceptualize whether the Nazis were left or right wing, I think we should quickly delineate between the ideals held by the typical left and typical right. I really hate reducing down political theory to a simple left-right binary, but for the sake of this video, some fundamental common ideals held by the typical non-authoritarian right are small government. Now, whether or not they actually remain consistent on that point is something we could save for another video. Rugged individualism, traditional values, and hierarchy. Typical left-wing priorities include equality, progressive change, collective good, and skepticism to hierarchy. Nazism, as you most likely already know, upholds traditional values and hierarchy. Given that leftists are inherently skeptical of those ideals, especially hierarchy, this should raise some red flags. But by that same token, just because Nazism shares some ideals with the modern right doesn't mean all that much. Alright, now that we got the boring stuff out of the way, let's get to the fun part. The most common argument I hear from people who try to paint the Nazis as socialist is that Nazi is an abbreviation for National Socialist, and socialist is right there in their name, dude. Remember, we just heard Peterson make that argument.
The socialist part of it wasn't accidental.
But Jordan should understand that being nominally something and actually something can be two different things. Would he make the argument that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is a democracy? These things happen all the time. Look at the Center Party of the Netherlands. They claim to be centrists, but they're... Oh. Well, that makes sense. This actually might be the most centrist thing of all. But no, although the Nazis were nominally socialist, they were not in practice. Let's substantiate this argument a little bit better. Communism is not socialism. Marxism is not socialism. The Marxians have stolen the term and confused its meaning. I shall take socialism away from the socialists. That was a quote from, you guessed it, Hitler. I originally planned to list out a few more quotes of his regarding his disdain for socialism, but I decided not to turn this video into a collection of Hitler quotes. I mean, a hefty portion of his shitty book is talking about taking socialism away from the Marxists. Aside from his own statements telling you he's not a socialist and he actually hates them for not being nationalists, let's check out his policy positions. A common misconception regarding the Nazis and their policies is that they coined the term privatization to describe their economic practices. This is only half true. They did engage in massive privatization efforts, but they did not coin the term. In a time where other countries were expanding their public sectors, the Nazi regime was among one of the first to implement large-scale privatization policies. They transferred control of major sectors such as steel, banking, railroads, and shipping back into private hands. This was part of their economic plan to bolster private enterprise and secure backing from industrialists and corporations, who became crucial to supporting the Nazi war effort. Now, although the Nazi protocol of privatization was definitely not socialist, given that socialism is social ownership of the means of production, it's also unfair to call it capitalist. Even though the means of production were privatized, it wasn't laissez-faire capitalism. It was corporatism, an unholy alliance between the state and corporations. Now, someone like myself would make the argument that capitalism, by its very nature, has the proclivity to devolve into corporatism or corporatocracy. But that's a whole other discussion. It's important to be honest and nuanced when talking about this instead of just associating Hitler with whatever ideology you dislike. So, if the Nazis weren't leftists and they weren't liberal capitalists, what were they? They were racist, anti-Semitic fascists. They were far-right. But to be fair to the people who believed they were left-wing, fascism, like socialism, is a collectivist ideology. Fascism relies heavily on themes of collective strength and the individual's subservience to the state. This is often illustrated through the fascist imagery of the bundle of sticks. A stick alone is weak, a bundle is strong. Socialism, on the other hand, although also a collectivist ideology, when truly understood, is about maximizing the individual within society, freeing them of exploitation and unjust hierarchy. The socialist places importance on collective good, but understands the individual's need for self-actualization. They believe that through challenging exploitative power dynamics, this becomes tenable. The fascist also relies heavily on ultranationalism, in-group, out-group rhetoric, and blood and soil arguments, all things prevalent in Nazi ideology. Fascists always need to frame themselves as being victimized by something or someone without engaging in proper analysis. In the case of Hitler's Nazi regime, he utilized the German humiliation from the First World War. He stoked racial tensions, fear-mongered about Jewish people, immigrants, homosexuality, perceived degeneracy, leftists, and more. But what I consider to be one of the most significant practices of the fascist is the bastardization and appropriation of sentiment and imagery. For example, the Nazis used the term socialist rhetorically to earn the support of the working class. They, in Hitler's own words, took socialism away from the socialists. You see this appropriation occur in other ways too, namely the swastika, which was originally a symbol of well-being in the Far East. This toothless populism, this attempt to come off as one with the working class, is common with fascists. Donald Trump, who I don't consider a Nazi, but I also don't see as a traditional conservative, can almost certainly be categorized as someone who flirts with fascistic rhetoric. His ultra-nationalist obsession with in-groups and out-groups, claiming that immigrants are poisoning the blood of the nation.
They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done.
Threats to terminate the Constitution and admiration for authoritarian strongmen around the world all contribute to this perception. There's a reasonable discussion to be had here, and those who consider him fascist adjacent have a valid argument. Trump often engages in this sort of toothless populism, this pandering to the working class while pitting them against immigrants, the swamp, or bureaucracy. He criticizes these institutions while simultaneously exacerbating their issues, doing little to address the problems he highlights. He says he's going to protect your job, and then he ships 200,000 of them overseas. He promises to cut your taxes, but permanently benefits the rich while only temporarily helping the working class. The point is that fascism, in whatever form it takes, often presents itself as a populist, working class sympathetic movement, like the Nazis did with their rhetorical use of the term socialist. However, with just a little more scrutiny, the corporatist, ultra-nativist nature presents itself, and the facade crumbles. Back to this dweeb. In addition to openly despising socialists, implementing mass privatization policies, and spreading anti-Semitic theories of cultural Bolshevism, Hitler also purged leftists, Marxists, and communists. In 1933, after the Reichstag, the German parliament, was set on fire, the Nazis blamed the Communist Party and used the event as an excuse to crack down on leftists. Thousands of communists were arrested, tortured, and sent to concentration camps, effectively eliminating the Communist Party as a political force in Germany. In 1934, the Night of Long Knives, which mainly claimed the lives of Hitler's internal competition, was also used to purge left-wing activists, socialists, and trade unionists. He frequently suppressed trade unions, which were heavily associated with left-wing politics, and he cracked down on labor organizers. At the end of the day, these little quips and the rudimentary analysis of historical events and political ideologies are fun and cute, but men like Prager and Peterson make a living in this field. We should expect them to at least try to make their shitty arguments sound clever. I guess what I'm saying is, Dennis, Jordan, be better sophists. That's enough out of me. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and comment and subscribe. And if you hated the video, give it a thumbs down and comment in a mean way and still subscribe. Thanks.